In the spring of 1864, a Union general did something that no one in that army had ever seen before. He didn't retreat. And that one decision, made in the middle of a burning forest in Virginia, quietly ended the Confederacy's last real hope of winning the war. Before this video is over, you're going to understand exactly how Ulysses S. Grant took a broken, humiliated Army of the Potomac and turned it into the machine that finally cornered Robert E. Lee, the general many still call the greatest tactical mind of the entire war. You'll see the moves, the sacrifices, and the cold, brutal math that Grant used to win a war that Lee, by every traditional measure, should have been able to keep fighting for years. If you appreciate real history, told straight, without the myths textbooks love to repeat, subscribe now, because this channel is where those stories live. Stay with me, because the next 2 minutes alone contain the single moment historians point to as the turning point of the entire American Civil War. It happened on the night of May 7, 1864, in a stretch of tangled Virginia woodland called the Wilderness. 2 days earlier, Grant's army had walked into that forest and been torn apart. Confusion, fire, thousands of casualties, a battle so chaotic that men shot their own comrades in the smoke because they couldn't see 3 feet in front of them. By every previous pattern of this war, this was the moment the Union Army was supposed to pull back. That's what had happened after Fredericksburg. That's what had happened after Chancellorsville. Every single time the Army of the Potomac bled badly against Robert E. Lee, it retreated north, regrouped, and gave Lee time to rest, resupply, and outmaneuver the next General Washington sent against him. Lee expected the same thing this time. His soldiers expected it too. But as the sun went down on May 7th, the Union columns began to move, and for a moment panic spread through the ranks because the men assumed they were being pulled back yet again. Then the road curved, and instead of turning north toward safety, toward Washington, the columns kept marching south, deeper into Confederate territory, toward Lee, toward Richmond. Men who had survived unspeakable slaughter 2 days earlier began cheering in the dark, some of them in tears because, for the first time in 3 years, they understood that their commander was not going to let a bloody battle stop the campaign. That single choice, to press forward instead of retreat, is the moment that changed the trajectory of the entire war. Lee had beaten armies before. He had never faced a general who refused to accept that beating as the end of the story. From that night forward, the war in the East became a completely different kind of fight, and Robert E. Lee, for the first time, was not the one dictating its terms. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand what Grant was walking into and what kind of opponent he was about to face. By 1864, Robert E. Lee had built a reputation that bordered on myth. He had defeated a string of Union commanders, some of them capable men, some of them simply overwhelmed by his aggression and his uncanny sense of timing. Lee fought a war of maneuver. He split his forces when logic said he shouldn't. He struck where the Union least expected it. He turned smaller armies into instruments of surprise, and time and again, Union generals who outnumbered him walked away defeated, sometimes humiliated, because they played the kind of war Lee wanted them to play. Grant had watched this pattern from the Western Theater, where he'd spent the earlier years of the war capturing forts, splitting the Confederacy along the Mississippi, and forcing surrenders that no one thought possible. When Lincoln finally brought him east in March of 1864 and made him general-in-chief of all Union armies, Grant did something almost no one expected. He didn't try to outmaneuver Lee. He didn't try to win a single, decisive, war-ending battle the way every general before him had dreamed of doing. Instead, Grant looked at the full picture of the war, the Union's overwhelming advantage in men, industry, and supply, and he built a strategy designed to make Lee's genius irrelevant. Grant's plan was simple to describe and brutal to execute. He would attack everywhere, all at once. Sherman would push through Georgia. Sheridan would tear apart the Shenandoah Valley, the breadbasket that fed Lee's army. Butler would threaten Richmond from the south, and Grant himself would attach his headquarters to the Army of the Potomac and do something no Union commander had managed before: keep constant, unrelenting pressure on Lee, no matter the cost, no matter how brutal the fighting became. Grant understood a hard truth that Northern newspapers and Northern politicians didn't want to hear. The Union could replace every soldier it lost. The Confederacy could not. If Grant simply refused to stop, refused to let Lee reset the board the way he always had, the math of the war would do the rest. This wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of daring, romantic generalship that made Lee famous. It was cold, deliberate attrition, dressed up as a campaign, and it terrified the men who had to fight it just as much as it terrified the Confederacy. The wilderness was only the beginning. After that fateful march south, Grant pushed his army toward a crossroads called Spotsylvania Court House, trying to slip around Lee's flank and get between the Confederate army and Richmond. Lee, moving with the speed that had made him famous, got there first and dug in. What followed was some of the most brutal, sustained combat of the entire war. For nearly 2 weeks, the two armies grappled in a series of engagements that culminated in a spot the soldiers themselves came to call the Bloody Angle, a stretch of earthworks where men fought hand to hand for close to 20 hours straight, in rain, in mud, over a piece of ground barely the size of a few football fields. Trees were shredded to splinters by rifle fire. Soldiers on both sides described it as the single worst experience of their lives, worse even than the chaos of the wilderness. And still, Grant did not retreat. He shifted, he probed, he pressed south again, always south, always toward Richmond, always forcing Lee to react to him instead of the other way around. This is the part of Grant's genius that gets overlooked because it doesn't look like genius in the traditional sense. Lee was still winning tactical engagements. His men were still inflicting heavier casualties than they were taking in many of these fights. If you only counted bodies on the battlefield day by day, you might think Lee was still the master of this war. But Grant wasn't fighting for a single battlefield anymore. He was fighting for the map and for time. Every day that Grant kept Lee pinned down and reacting was a day Lee could not maneuver, could not resupply properly, could not rest his exhausted, increasingly outnumbered army. Every mile Grant pushed south was a mile closer to Richmond and to cutting off the railroads that kept Lee's men fed. Grant absorbed losses that would have ended the career of almost any other Union general, and the Northern public, reading the casualty lists in horror, began calling him a butcher. But Grant understood something Lee's earlier opponents never had. This war would not be won by a single brilliant stroke. It would be won by refusing to let the other side ever catch its breath. Then came Cold Harbor in early June of 1864, and it very nearly became the campaign's darkest chapter. Grant ordered a frontal assault against heavily entrenched Confederate positions, and the result was a slaughter, thousands of Union casualties in a matter of minutes. One of the worst tactical decisions Grant ever made, and he knew it. He said so himself afterward, admitting he regretted ordering that attack more than almost any other decision of the war. It would have been easy for the campaign to collapse right there under the sheer moral weight of that failure. Instead, Grant did the one thing that continued to define his entire approach. He absorbed the mistake, adjusted, and kept moving. Within days, in one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the entire war, Grant secretly disengaged his enormous army, marched it south, and crossed the James River on pontoon bridges, slipping away from Lee entirely and racing toward the vital rail center of Petersburg, the city that supplied Richmond and kept Lee's entire army alive. For the first time in the campaign, Grant had genuinely outmaneuvered Lee, catching him by surprise. Only a stroke of Confederate luck and some hesitation among Union commanders on the ground kept Petersburg from falling in an instant and preserved Lee's army for a few more months. But those few more months came at a terrible cost for the Confederacy, because what followed was a siege, and a siege was exactly the kind of war Lee could not win. Trapped in trenches around Petersburg and Richmond, Lee's army was slowly strangled. Grant kept extending his lines, stretching them further and further west, forcing Lee to spread his shrinking, starving army thinner and thinner just to hold the ground. Meanwhile, Sheridan's cavalry tore through the Shenandoah Valley, burning crops and barns, destroying the very food supply that kept Lee's men alive. Sherman had taken Atlanta and was marching toward the sea, splitting what remained of the Confederacy in two. The strategy Grant had designed back in the spring, pressure everywhere, all at once, no rest, no reset, was closing in exactly as he had planned. Lee's soldiers, some of the finest, most battle-hardened infantry in American history, began to starve in their own trenches. Desertion, almost unheard of in Lee's army during the war's earlier years, became a daily occurrence because there was simply nothing left to fight with. By April of 1865, the siege lines finally broke. Petersburg fell, Richmond fell, and Lee's army, what remained of it, fled west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces and continue the fight. Grant did not let him. Union cavalry and infantry moved with a speed that mirrored Grant's entire philosophy of the war, relentless, coordinated, unwilling to give Lee the one thing he had always used to save his army before, room to breathe. Supply trains meant for Lee's starving men were captured before they could arrive. Escape routes were cut off one by one, and on April 9, 1865, at a small Virginia village called Appomattox Court House, Robert E. Lee, the general who had humiliated a string of Union commanders for 3 straight years, found himself completely surrounded, his army reduced to a fraction of its former strength, with no food, no path forward, and no options left. He had no choice but to ask for terms. The man whose battlefield brilliance had defined the entire war for the Confederacy was forced to surrender, not because Grant had outfought him in a single decisive clash, but because Grant had refused for 11 relentless months to ever let him reset the board. That is the real genius of Grant's war strategy, and it's the part so many retellings of this story miss. Grant did not need to be a better tactician than Lee on any single day. Lee likely remained the sharper battlefield commander almost the entire way through this campaign. What Grant understood, earlier and more clearly than any general before him, was that the Confederacy's only real hope of winning this war was to make the fighting so costly that the North gave up before its advantages in men and material could ever be brought to bear. Every previous Union general had unintentionally played into that hope by retreating after every hard fight, giving Lee the initiative, the rest, and the time he needed to keep the war alive. Grant simply refused to give him any of it. He turned the Union's greatest advantage, its ability to absorb losses and keep coming, into a weapon. And he wielded it with a discipline that history has often mistaken for recklessness. The soldiers who marched south through the wilderness that night in May of 1864 didn't fully understand what they were witnessing, but they were watching the exact moment the war's outcome was decided, more than a full year before Lee finally laid down his sword at Appomattox. What's remarkable, looking back from where we sit now, is how differently this story is often told. Lee is remembered, and rightly so in many respects, as one of the most gifted battlefield commanders America ever produced. But battlefield brilliance was never going to be enough against an opponent who had correctly diagnosed the true shape of the war and built his entire strategy around it. Grant's genius wasn't flashy. It didn't produce the kind of dramatic single-battle turning point that makes for an easy legend. It was quieter than that, and in some ways darker, because it demanded a willingness to accept terrible losses in service of a larger, colder calculation. But it worked. And it worked precisely because Grant refused to fight the war Lee wanted him to fight. He fought his own war instead, on his own terms, and he never let up until there was nothing left for Lee to do but surrender. If this kind of history, the real strategy and decision-making behind the moments that shaped this country, is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more of it coming. And if there's another general, another battle, or another turning point from this war you want broken down like this, drop it in the comments, because these videos are shaped just as much by this community as they are by the history itself. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next one.